Deep diving into Edda Poems, a new lecture series by Maria Kvilhaug, 2023 to 2024. The full series will be published on patreon.com Maria Kvilhaug. Þá reid Óðinn fyrir austandyr, þar hann vissi völu leiði, nam hann vittugri Valgaldr kveða, und naudig reis, nås ord hvað. Vegtams kvíða, Edda Baldrs draumar. Then rode Óðinn to the east of the death door. There he knew about a Völva's grave. He knew for the wise woman to sing the spells of resurrection until the reluctant corpse rose and spoke the words of the dead. The Song of Waywant, or Baldr's Dreams. The Poetic Edda. Frøya kvað, vaki mær meia, vaki min vina, Hyndla, syster, I hellig byr. Nu raukra, rida vit skulum, til Valhallar og til Væs heilags. Hyndluljóð. Freyja sang, wake up, maiden of maidens. Wake up, my friend, she-wolf, sister, who lives in the cliff cave. Now is the darkness of darkness itself. Ride we should to Valhalla and to the holy shrine. The Song of the She-wolf, the Poetic Edda. Soner kvað, vaki du, Gróa, vaki du, god kona, vekek þik, daudra dura. Ef du that mant at du din mög bæðir til kumbeldyssjar koma. Svipdagsmål, Grógaldr. The sun sang, wake up to grow, wake up, good woman. I wake you by the doors of death. If you can recall that you bid your son to come to your burial cairn. The speech of swift dawn, spell song to grow, the Poetic Edda. Vindkaldr kvað, seg du mer datt Fjølsvidr, rekk frägna mun, och vilja vita. Vatt att bjarg heiter, verek se brudi å, tjodmæra fruma. Fjølsvidr kvad, lyfja berg that heiter, en that hefir lengi verit, sjukum och sårum gaman. Heil verder vær, þótt hafi år sått, that klífer kona. Svipdagsmål, Fjølsvinnsmál. Windcold sang, tell me this, much knowing, as I want to ask you, and I want to know. What is that mountain called, where I see the bride seated, the great maiden dreaming? Much knowing sang, the mountain of medicine it is called, and that has long been the joy of the sick and the wounded. Whole is each woman, despite years of anguish, if she climbs that mountain. the speech of swift dawn, the speech of much knowing, the poetic Edda. Hon kvað, lengi eg svaf, lengi eg sofnod var, lang lyda læ. Odin því veldur eg eigi mottak, bregða blundstöfum. Sigurðr fumon. She sang, long did I sleep, long was my slumber, long is the woe of the peoples. Odin this caused that I could not manage to break the spell of sleep. The speech of Victory Drift, the poetic Edda. Vaki thu, frodig, vaki thu, frodig, efter lyda vill, sångum akrum och sögum fornum. Grotta sönger. Wake up, wisdom, wake up, wisdom, if you want to hear our songs and our ancient tales. The Song of the Millstone of Destiny, the poetic Edda. Let us begin with a brief history of the Christian conversion and the lore keepers of the Middle Ages. Since we are going to deal with source material that dates to centuries after the conversion to Christianity, we need to have a quick survey of the historical context of this era, a brief history of Christianity in northwestern Europe. England, or the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Ireland and Frankland were the first Germanic-speaking countries that became Christian, sometime during the 500s and 600s. After that, Frankland became very powerful. Towards the end of the 700s, under the reign of Charlemagne, they had expanded their territories into large parts of what is today Germany, regarding themselves as the last remains of the Western Roman Empire, and they had violently defeated the pagan Saxons and the Frisians. The Franks now posed a threat to the Danish border, but from the 790s, Danish and other Scandinavian fleets began to launch raids against Christian monasteries and sacred sites, as if they were targeting Christianity itself. These raids proved so lucrative to the Scandinavian pirates that such pirate, as in Viking raids against the Christian world, became a sort of summer holiday thing for the next couple of centuries. The Viking Age had begun and was quite effective in keeping Christian missionaries and Christian invaders at bay for more than a century. However, according to Adam of Bremen, who wrote about the process of conversion in the north back in the 1070s, the Frankish emperor Otto the Red, who ruled between 955 and 983, invaded pagan Denmark in the year 967 and won. The king of Denmark at the time was Haraldr Gormson Blåtann, as in Bluetooth, who had no other way of saving himself and his supporters than to let himself be baptized and promise to christen all of Denmark. And so, in 967, Denmark was officially a Christian country. Several important noblemen from Norway and Sweden had been fighting next to Harald against the Christian army, and were also force baptized. What did not sit well with all of them? One of them, Håkon Blodjarl, also known as Hladajarl or just Håkon Jarl, returned to Norway in a state of perpetual rage against the humiliation of being force baptized, and Håkon Jarl became the most powerful defender of the pagan religion in the history of Norway, a resistance that would last until 1030, when the last pagans had to give way to the new religion in Norway too. But back to Denmark. Here, too, there were people who had felt deeply humiliated by the forced baptism of themselves and their people. Haraldr Blåtann died in 985, and his son Svein, who had been forced baptized as Svein Otto, was elected as the new king of the Danes. Yes, the pagans held elections and had a far more democratic system than the Christian world. So Svein was elected as king of the Danes and was known as Svein Tjugeskjegg, as in twin-beard. But to the dismay of the Christian Franks, Svein had relapsed into paganism, which was exactly why he was elected king, going to show that many of those who had been force baptized were just waiting for a chance to be unbaptized. Paganism once more flourished in Denmark side by side with the people who had taken the new religion to heart. The chronicles claim that after a great defeat against the Swedish King Eirik, Svein returned to Denmark and took to Christianity once more. However, it was not until Svein's death in 1014 that Denmark gradually became a real Christian country. While this was happening in Denmark, Norway got its first Christian kings. The very first was Eirik Bloodaxe, son of Harald Hairfair by his Danish wife, who ruled large parts of Norway between 930 after the Harald's death and 935. Having had support from the English, Eirik Bloodaxe had been baptized, but Eirik was more into killing off his half-brothers than into spreading the good word. It was this bloodthirst that led to him being nicknamed Bloodaxe. Besides, Eirik was very unpopular because he was trying to make the free farmer population of Norway into his serfs like they did in the continental Europe, and Norway remained as pagan as before. Around the same time, England gave support, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, gave support to Eirik's youngest half-brother, Håkon the Good, who was a devout Christian, and by 935 Håkon became king of all Norway. He tried to convert the population to Christianity, but the Norwegian population flatly refused, and some sources suggest that after Håkon gave up on his missionary projects in favor of remaining king, who had been democratically elected by the people, he became so friendly with pagans that he was given a pagan burial when he died in 961. After Håkon's death in 961, Håkon Blodjarl became the most powerful man in Norway and ruled the country in all but title for the next 30 years or so, fervently suppressing the spread of the Christian religion. But in the year 995, Håkon Jarl was defeated by the Christian king Olafr Tryggvason, who was the first king to have some success in the conversion of the Norwegian population. He was very violent about it, by the way. And Olaf Tryggvason's violence against pagan people did not render him that popular. Large parts of the Norwegian population were still pagan, and great religious wars were being fought for the next 35 years until the death of Olaf Tryggvason's successor, Olafr the Holy, in 1030. After that, Norway as a country converted fully to Christianity. So we see that both Denmark and Norway started to become Christian during the 11th century. That would be the 1000 to 1100. But paganism still existed during this era. In Sweden, a king called Eirik let himself be baptized sometime in the 990s, but it was not until nearly a century later, in 1080, that the great pagan temple of Uppsala was destroyed and replaced by a church. So we can assume that despite having missionaries and despite having some Christian kings, significant parts of the Swedish population also held to their ancient faith throughout this 11th century. In Iceland, Christianity also began to spread towards the end of the 900s. Iceland was a democratic republic where everybody enjoyed freedom of religion, so the conflicts between the religions seem to have been more verbal, focused on discussion and proofs of which faith was the most powerful. However, by the year 1000, almost half of the voting population in Iceland had become Christians and voted in Christianity as their state religion. However, they were very democratic and had a tradition of religious freedom, so paganism was still allowed in Iceland for those who wanted to practice it, and paganism was not outlawed until nearly 100 years later. So it was not until the year 1100 that we could say that the last real pagans, practicing pagans and believing pagans of Iceland and Scandinavia told their last stories and showed their last spiritual secrets to their Christian children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Law texts from this era and several centuries to come, both Icelandic and Norwegian, offer detailed descriptions of pagan rituals that were now unlawful, illegalized. And these descriptions of such rituals and the laws against them show that paganism was being practiced, first legally, then illegally, for a few centuries after the first official conversions. Of the pagan spiritual traditions, only the skaldskap, the art of poetry, was still legal. Skalds belonging to this millennia-old tradition were still being educated as such. They began to weave in new Christian references to their poetry, but they were still the transmitters of age-old pagan terms and concepts, simply by being poets using the traditional poetical metaphors, which always referenced pagan themes. The first monasteries in the north probably came into being during the 1st century when Christianity became powerful, between 1000 and 1100, a time when lots of actual practicing pagans were also still breathing and practicing and spreading their myths through the art of poetry and storytelling, and through other sort of art too, like wood carvings, tapestries, paintings. By the 1100s, we know for certain that chronicles were being written down by monastic scribes, who were often paid to do so by professional skalds or their supporters. They wrote mostly in Latin, but in Iceland there were people who saw the value of preserving their own language and poetry and sagas in writing. The priests Ari Frodi, who lived between 1067 and 1148, and Sæmundur the Wise, who lived between 1056 and 1133, were among the first people who began recording ancient lore in the Old Norse language. Both of these men were born and grew up into adulthood during a century when paganism was still legal in Iceland and still practiced both in Iceland and large parts of Scandinavia. They referred to oral transmitters among the pagan population, both men and women, and saw fit to include pagan poetry and lore. After them, writing in Old Norse became the norm in Iceland, ensuring the preservation of language throughout the centuries, so that Icelanders today are among the few who still speak a language that is very close to the Old Norse. The Scandinavians, Norwegians, Swedes and Danish people resorted mostly to Latin, and the languages of Denmark, Sweden and Norway came to change quite radically for the following centuries, especially after the bubonic plague in the 1340s. The oldest collection of Edda poetry, found in a copy from the late 1100s, nicknamed the Codex Regius, has often been attributed to Sæmund the Wise, hence the alternative title Sæmundar Edda, the Poetic Edda, although we do not know if this is correct, and the original manuscript was lost to us. Several copies were made from this first codex, but only one of these copies survived, and possibly only survived because a mysterious family in Iceland preserved this manuscript secretly for more than 3 centuries, keeping it away from the authorities until the 1640s, more than 300 years. We see, therefore, a tradition of writing down, preserving, copying and publishing sagas and poems from pagan times, from the 1050s until the present day. This love for traditional literature flourished in Iceland for centuries and still exists. Icelanders often came from Norwegian ancestry, and Iceland was a part of a large Norwegian commonwealth until the 1380s, so there was a great deal of focus on Norwegian history. Also in Norway were chronicles being recorded. A book known as Konungs Skuggsjå, the King's Mirror, was written down in Norway around 1250, meant to educate royalty to become good and just kings, as well as knowledgeable. Here we find, for example, a description in the Old Norse language of how the earth is round like a ball and how we can scientifically prove it. One of the oldest descriptions of this sort of knowledge in post-classical Europe. And this goes to show a little about this time period, the 1200s, also known as the 13th century. This was a time of pre-enlightenment. It's like the earliest part of the Renaissance that is usually thought to have started around 1400. But actually during the 1200s there was also a time of Renaissance. Old classical works were being studied, and with these science and scientific thought returned to the Western world. Knowledge about history, interest in history, learning about the past, philosophies, sciences was all the vogue, and also the deeper spiritual and metaphorical traditions of classical mystery religions and Neoplatonism. Christian mysticism and visionaries flourished, obviously inspired by classical roots. Studying the pagan beliefs of the classical world was legitimized by claiming that they were all about allegories and parables for the human spiritual condition, which is actually also how these myths were seen by those pagans who were initiated into mystery religions in the classical era. The people of Iceland and Norway in this era obviously thought that not only the classical world with its science, philosophy, languages and amazing history was worth knowing about and be inspired by. They saw in their own history, language and lore the same potential for learning. They also wanted to establish themselves as another great culture next to all the other ones, for they had a reputation of being only descended from barbarian pirates, bandits and their slaves. They wanted to show that they too had a great classical time period behind them, despite the paganism. They tried to show that the pagan beliefs made sense when seen as a wisdom tradition, a poetical tradition, rather than a religious one, and they wanted their kings to know that they too descended from cultural greatness. It was in this sort of environment that the skald Snorri Sturluson lived and worked, and with him many others who took care to preserve both language and cultural memory. They were acutely aware that if they did not record everything in writing, it would be forgotten. In the year 1220, Snorri remarked that young people now, that is in the 1220s, had problems understanding traditional poetry because they had lost the mythological and cultural references that this poetry was based on, and he wanted them to know that which had been subtly composed and hidden in riddles and symbols. However, in 1346, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, came, eradicating more than half of the population in northwestern Europe. Norway, in particular, suffered a hard blow to their cultural elites. Most people who could read and write simply died off. The Norwegian royal dynasty was also crumbling. While Norway was trying to get back on its feet after the plague and to save their history and culture, the great Old Norse history chronicle Flatøyarbok was sponsored by the Norwegian-descended Icelandic chief Jon Håkonsson, who commissioned two Icelandic priests, Jon Tordsson and Magnus Thorhallsson, to gather old written sources and write a grand saga with the purpose of emphasizing the greatness of Norwegian kings from the pagan era and into the Christian one. It is in Flatøyarbok, written between 1385 and 1395, that we find the oldest source to the Edda poem Hyndluljóð, where this poem was copied from older sources and was here used to mythically describe the ancient lineages of Norwegian dynasties. The book was intended to be gifted to the last Norwegian king, Olafur VII. But this king died already in 1387, while they had only started to work on this book, and the Icelanders who were working on the chronicle after his death now focused on a more general history of Norway and Iceland, and the book stayed in Iceland. After the death of the last Norwegian king of the Hårfagre lineage, the Norwegian Commonwealth, which included Iceland, became a part of the union between Denmark, Sweden and Norway under the Danish queen Margrethe in 1389. Sweden withdrew from this union in 1434 and became an independent and quite powerful state, but Norway stayed on as a sort of vassal state beneath Denmark until 1814. Then Norway went into a submissive union with Sweden until 1905, when Norway was finally an independent kingdom with its own elected king. Iceland, of course, which had been a part of the Norwegian Commonwealth since the 1200s, was also such a vassal state under Denmark, all the way until 1944, when Iceland was once more declared an independent republic. While all this was happening, great religious wars were being fought between the Protestants and the Catholics under Denmark. Until Denmark approved of Protestantism in 1536. All the vassal states, including Norway and Iceland, became Protestant. People did not have a choice in this regard. They were just told to become Protestants. And this was also, interestingly, the time of the great witch hunts and heretic hunts in Scandinavia. The conversion to Protestantism did not stop this process, but rather enhanced it. Now, whispering Catholic prayers in Latin was seen as sorcery and punishable by death. Many witch burnings happened simply to die-hard Catholics. Heretics and witches of the 1600s did not fare much better, but by this time an age of enlightenment had long since flourished right next to the witch and heresy hunting. like two opposite streams working their ways through society. One stream where zealots obsessed about heresy and witchcraft were trying to burn people and torture people, and another where knowledge of the past was being sought. The classical world was once more studied with its philosophy, its science, and its allegories and spiritual mysteries. And then old things started to resurface. In 1643, the Codex Regius, or the Sämundar Edda, what we also know as the Poetic Edda, a manuscript from the late 1100s, copied from an even older manuscript, was given over from the people who had safe kept it for more than 3 centuries on end, given to the Bishop of Iceland, who gave it over to the Danish king, where it was immediately being studied again. In 1647, the pagan temple of the goddess Nehalenia, dating back to the 200s, resurfaced from the ocean into which it had sunk more than 1,200 years before. In 1656, the Flateyjarbók was given over from its private library in Iceland, not to the Norwegian king as was previously intended, but to the Danish king. They didn't have a Norwegian king at this time anyway. At this point, a new interest in the classical age of Scandinavia, as well as in folklore and ancient tradition, came to grow. Folklore and new material, forgotten manuscripts, all were once more being opened up, dusted off and studied, and published with the printing press so that many more could access them. It is in this time period that we find our latest Edda sources. Of course, they were copied from older works now lost, but we only have them, these late sources, these late copies. And these include poems such as the Grógaldr and the Fjőlsvinnsmál, Hrafnagaldur-Odins and the Solarljóð. And there were also several copies of the Hyndluljóð and various versions of the other poems, the other Edda poems found in the Codex Regius or Sämundar Edda. Also, during the 1800s, we see another surge of interest in the lore of the past, when diverse folklorists went about collecting fairy tales and describing strange customs in the countryside that were strangely reminiscent of their pagan roots. And new studies and attempts to make the old lore available to the masses also flourished. In Norway especially, the fight for independence from both Denmark and Sweden led to increased interest in the past, especially the Icelandic sources, which often described Norwegian history as a once grand kingdom with its own commonwealth, which served to fuel the desire to restore national independence. The result was massive funding of new research, translations, and publishing of ancient works. Introduction. Our sources and their sources. Edda poetry is the term traditionally used for a type of poetry in the Old Norse language, known from Icelandic and Scandinavian written sources dating back to the early Middle Ages or later, but with obvious roots in an older pagan era. Both Edda poetry and Scaldic poetry belonged to a tradition known as skaldskap and were composed or transmitted by skaldr, professional bards or poets. Edda poetry and skaldskap. The roots of the mythical and legendary lore are found in a time before writing, in a time when such stories, songs and poems were transmitted orally through time by various kinds of storytellers, everything from the old grandmother to the traveling storyteller to the professionally educated skald. A skald was a poet a bard who was trained and highly educated in how to compose and how to recite poetry. Their art was called skaldskap, which means the creation of poetry. This art of poetry, the skaldskap, was listed among the various arts of Fjölkyngi, great knowledge, alongside Seidr, berserksgangur, galdrar, runes, and various forms of spirit invocation, witchcraft, sorcery, and what we today would refer to as shamanism, as an umbrella term. Basically, all these arts of Fjölkyngi, great knowledge, that Odin, the god, taught. The skaldskap, alongside all the other kinds of Fjölkyngi, of great knowledge, required long training and initiation rites. It required this long training and initiation rites in order to become a skald, and a skald had to learn hundreds, even thousands, of verses by heart. A skald was basically a walking library, author and audiobook device in their time. They would both compose poetry and recite older poetry, and be able to retell the prose version myths and sagas on which the poetry was based. The poems made by Norse Scaldic that we know of today are divided into two main categories: Scaldic poetry and Edda poetry. The Edda poetry has a particular style which is somewhat simpler and less bound in form than the Scaldic poetry, and the Edda poetry always deal with mythical and supernatural lore. They could be about human beings, but these human beings would be very actively engaged with supernatural beings such as Valkyria and other mythical creatures. The Edda poems were composed in a manner that was easily remembered by a people that were used to learning everything by heart, due to lack of books and writing in general. Through rhythm and other rules, it would have been easy to remember them and recite them correctly, or semi-correctly. This is why I believe they could be very old by the time they were written down. However, the form is not as strict as it is in Scaldic poetry, which means that it would have been possible to alter them on the way. For example, add a word or remove a word here and there, even compose alternative verses. This is why it is somewhat problematic to determine just how old the poems are, at least in the forms that we know about, those that were written down later. Another difference between Scaldic poetry and Edda poetry is that the Edda poems are never credited to any named or particular author. Even if they were surely composed by known and professional Scaldir, it was as if they belonged to everybody and nobody. Some of them, maybe most of them, or at least parts of them, or at least earlier lost versions of the ones we know today, may certainly have had a religious and ceremonial purpose at some point in history. The Scaldic poetry was composed in a far more complicated manner and in a more bound form than the Edda poems, and they were credited to named authors. For the most part, we know who these Scaldir were. We know their names. We even know their life stories, because these are often described in the saga literature, where we find most of their poems, the Scaldic poems, recited. Usually also recited in the historical and social context that they were believed to have been first composed. So we have usually the saga shows a scene where this skald is experiencing something and then composing a verse or 10. Out of all our written sources, these Scaldic poems are the most certain sources we have to ancient history and pagan beliefs, exactly because of their complex and bound form. They could not be altered, the words could not be changed, and they were easily remembered due to the rules of rhyming and alliteration. They are our most certain windows into the minds of an actual pagan era. Most of the Scaldic poems deal with contemporary events witnessed by the Scaldir themselves, such as battles they attended, like some sort of journalists, and they would be quite accurate too, since they were meant to be recited before an audience who had all been there. For example, if you were a skald who partook in a battle alongside all your comrades, afterwards, if you were victorious, you were to make a poem about your grand victory. You might emphasize the valor and the bravery of the men on your own side, of course, but you couldn't actually lie either, because people would know if it was a lie, because they had been there. So they were considered and may actually be quite accurate. However, despite usually dealing with real-life events, they always apply mythical imagery in their poems in order to make poetical metaphors that were at the heart and core of skaldskap. Some of the Scaldic poems also describe mythical paintings and artworks that the skald was looking at when composing a poem about the mythical events pictured on the shield or on the wall or on a tapestry or a wood carving. So from the saga literature we know that skalds who were standing there looking at a wall full of paintings or any other piece of art basically, which dealt with mythical events, could use these illustrations to create and compose a poem about mythical lore. And this is when we find Scaldic poetry retelling pagan mythological lore. And these are because of their bound form and their historical context in the Viking Age. The pagan Viking Age. These are our most certain and oldest sources into actual pagan mythology. In this new work, I am going to focus on Edda poetry, their content, meanings and purposes, as well as their contexts, the historical context, their possible ritual and religious contexts or roots, or else their places in a literature context. I will also discuss to what degree we may assume that these poems emerge from a pagan mindset and a pagan culture. Why do we have to ask ourselves this? Well, because these Edda poems, as well as any other piece of literature from the Old Norse era, they were written down in a Christian era, sometime after the conversion to Christianity. And so they may of course have been altered as soon as they were handled by new medieval Christian minds. Some of these Edda poems may even have been composed by Christian poets, because the tradition of skaldskap did not die with Christianity. It actually continued a couple of hundred years into the Middle Ages. So that the skalds would start using both the Old Norse pagan mythological imageries, but also create new poetical metaphors based on the new religion. So we have a time period where we find known skaldir who are using both Christian and pagan mythological lore in order to create their poetry. So it is my basic opinion that this modern focus that is very common today, this focus on Christian influence on all these poems, it may be overrated. So my basic purpose is to reveal the deeply pagan ritual references and spiritual concerns of a much earlier age that I perceive exists just as powerfully as any sort of Christian influence in all these poems. How old are the Edda poems? When did this art of skaldskap begin? We do not know, but the skaldskap was already a well-established art during the pagan Viking Age, and there are descriptions of such storytelling way back in the Iron Ages. It is likely a very ancient tradition that was transmitted through the generations for at least 1,000 years or more, and well into the High Middle Ages. Snorri Sturluson, for example, was one among the very last Scaldic in Iceland. I have seen people imagining Snorri Sturluson seated like a medieval scribe, like a monk, like a writer, writing down his many sagas and poems. But this is not the truth. Snorri Sturluson had the money to pay scribes from the local monasteries to write down his stories and the poems that he recited orally. But he himself stood there on the floor, speaking, telling stories, reciting the lore of old, exactly in the manner of every skald who ever lived. The only difference was that Snorri lived in a time and had the means to hire the scribes who put his words down on leather pages as faithfully as they could muster. Snorri knew hundreds of sagas and poems by heart. He was one of the last oral transmitters in a tradition that may well reach back more than 1,000 years. He made sure to have these stories and poems recorded because he realized that the ancient art of poetry was about to be forgotten. This was the 1220s, guys. About to be forgotten by these younger generations who no longer had the same mythical and cultural and religious references that were always hinted to in the poems. Snorri even had a whole book written down about how to interpret and create poetical metaphors based on pagan mythology, a way of preserving knowledge of the poetical traditions so that the future generations could understand that which, he said, was subtly composed and hidden in symbols. Today, this work is known as the Prose Edda, and usually it is just read in simplified translations as a book about Norse mythology. And I can guarantee you that most of the common knowledge about Norse myths is from this book today. I have asked people to tell me something they think they know about Norse mythology, and I would tell them where the source is for that, and I think like 90% was from Snorri. Even and this is even from people who sort of dismiss Snorri because he was a Christian. The problem with dismissing someone because they were a Christian is that then you can't read anything that was written down. You can't read the sagas, you can't read even the Eddas, you can't read anything because these things were not written down until Christianity arrived and the church came with their scribes and their art of bookmaking. This came with Christianity. So all our sources are written down by people who were either were real Christians or who had to be because it was illegal to not be a Christian in this time. So don't dismiss them just because of that. We just have to learn ways of discerning the Christian influence from the older pagan influence. And in any case, the purpose of the Prose Edda was to explain how poetical metaphors worked and what they referred to, so that the art of skaldskap would not be forgotten. This is clearly stated in the Prose Edda by Snorri himself. This purpose of trying to actually preserve the knowledge of poetical metaphors and how they worked and what they referred to. And while this was done, Snorri also managed to preserve lots of ancient poetry and saga lore for us to enjoy later. And Snorri was, of course, not the only one. Other people also made sure to have things written down, whether they, like Snorri, paid scribes to write down their oral recitations, or whether they sat down to record the stories themselves. Later on, other scholars were hired to copy older works, or to make new chronicles based on these older sources, and by listening to the stories of old people who remembered more of the lore of old. The Edda poems that we know today, in the form we know them today, were exactly such copies of older recordings that are now lost to us. Copies made between 1200 AD and as late as the 1600s. So these copies are late copies, but they are copies of older works, what I refer to as ghost sources, because they are lost to us today. The poems, in the form that we today know them, are of course a product of the time that they were copied, but also of the time that the original recordings were made, the ones that were copied from, and of the time that preceded the Christian era, when they were transmitted orally through the generations. They may have been altered with each new recital, and with each recording, and with each copying, but some core narrative and ritual incantations have certainly survived from the pagan era. But just how far back in time may these poems reach, or at least their earliest versions? The only true answer is that we do not know exactly. They may be very old. The Edda poems that we still know about deal with mythical and ritual themes of an obvious pagan origin. They may carry on narratives, styles, and themes of the earliest dawn of the Norse pagan religion. Some themes and narratives may even reach back into a time before that. There are mythical themes and core narratives in the world that seem incredibly old. As an example, take the concept of the Seven Sisters. This concept deals with a stellar constellation, the Pleiades, and usually follow a narrative about how the seven sisters, representing the seven visible stars of the Pleiades, are being chased by a hunter or a man who wants to woo them. Stories with this particular theme are found in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and even Australia. We know that the Australian Aborigines were separated from the rest of the world more than 60,000 years ago. We know that a significant migration from Africa into the rest of the world happened more than 70,000 years ago. Some of these Seven Sisters myths even include an explanation of why the eighth sister is no longer visible in the sky, and the eighth star of the Pleiades has not been visible for 100,000 years, not visible from Earth. The sheer widespreadness of this core narrative about the seven sisters and the man who chases them means that this is a narrative with roots into such a distant prehistory that it hardly seems possible, and yet the core narrative has survived the many onslaughts of time. Maybe it was remembered by so many in so different places because there was a constant reminder in the sky, the Pleiades constellation. But it goes to show that some stories may be of extreme antiquity and yet still remembered, still told. Even in Edda poetry, recorded in the early 1200s, do we hear of the Systrar Sjau, the 7 sisters, and we hear about them twice, either described as rune-carving Norns in the afterlife, or as women who could dig the ground out of valleys and spin threads out of sand, and who were lured into becoming Odin's lovers. So, let us take a brief peek at the possible origins of Norse myths, those still known to us, known simply because of the dedication of certain medieval nerds who had the sense to record some of the Edda and Scaldic poetry still remembered, because of Snorri and other medieval scholars who took care to preserve them for posterity, for us. The last ice age ended, or receded for a good while, still receded. Well, the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago. For the first time in 200,000 years, people could find land and livelihood in Scandinavia. Ice Age hunter-gatherers moved into the peninsula, coming either from both the southeast and the southwest. They brought with them their Ice Age myths, legends, songs and stories. Some scenes were carved into stone, some hints laid down in graves, but we do not know the exact nature of their stories. However, certain core narratives and themes may have survived into the following ages. Some 6,000 years ago, a new migration wave came to the north, this time from southeastern Europe, or what the archaeologist Maria Kvilhaug once labelled as Old Europe. They brought with them the art of agriculture and lived for a millennia side by side with the older hunter-gatherer populations. Archaeology shows that both kinds of cultures existed at the same time, but gradually moved in favor of agriculture. DNA shows that the different cultures certainly mingled little by little until the farmers had become more dominant in Scandinavia than the hunter-gatherers. They certainly brought with them a new religion and a new set of myths. There also appears to have been some influence from the southwestern megalith cultures, as megalithic constructions also appeared in Denmark and in southern Scandinavia during this era. There may very well be ancient origins to certain Norse mythology themes, narratives, and characters, reaching back into the agricultural Stone Age and the hunter-gatherer's Ice Age. But since nothing was written down from these cultures in ancient times, these connections are not possible to prove. We do not even know what sort of languages were spoken. However, comparative mythology shows that Norse myths do share some themes and narratives with Finno-Ugric kinds of lore, and Finno-Ugric peoples with origins in the first Ice Age migration to the north, the part that came from the southeast, the Uralic area, was certainly present both in Finland and all the way into the Scandinavian peninsula. So I said we do not know what sort of languages they spoke. Well, there could have been more than one language, of course. There were many different kind of tribes there, descended from different migrations and different people who joined with each other later. But some of the languages were most certainly Finno-Ugric. The Sami language, for example, is a Finno-Ugric language, and the Sami cultures emerged as representatives of the last remnants of the Ice Age lifestyle and religion in Scandinavia at least 3,000 years ago, and with provable roots into the Ice Age. DNA studies have shown that the Sami people have a far larger percentage of Ice Age first-comer DNA than the rest of Scandinavians. Well, we all have these percentages of Ice Age first-comer DNA, but the Sami tend to have more of it than the rest of Scandinavians. And the Sami also have a smaller percentage from the later agricultural and Indo-European migrations. Basically, when it comes to DNA in Scandinavia, everybody have traces of all the grand migrations that happened in ancient times, all of us. But the Sami have less of the late-coming agricultural migrations, while the rest of Scandinavians have more of the late arrivals than the Sami have, and less of the Ice Age first-comer DNA. But in any case, having lived side by side with the Norse-speaking populations for thousands of years, mutual influences on culture and storytelling lore must certainly have taken place. Some 5,000 years ago, a third grand migration entered Scandinavia, often in archaeology referred to as the boat axe culture, although there are different terms for it. In any case, these brought with them a new language family, the Indo-European one, and a very new kind of culture type. They also brought with them a new religion and a new set of myths, which probably blended in with the native traditions. But this is when we can find ancient source evidence for the origin of certain mythological characters and narratives that may have survived into the Edda poetry that we know. Other Indo-European speaking cultures, from India to Iran and all the way into Western Europe, ended up recording myths and stories that have so much in common with our Norse mythology that they most certainly share very ancient origins, perhaps stemming from the time when Indo-European speaking peoples came to dominate in all these lands 5,000 years ago. And, well, a millennia happened, And some 4,000 years ago, the three different migration groups had blended almost completely, with the exception of a few still hunter-gatherer populations that were to become the Sami. They had blended almost completely into a new Scandinavian culture known to us as the Nordic Bronze Age. This is where many of the origins of later Norse culture, language and religion seem to have formed. We know for a fact that the Nordic Bronze Age had intensive contact with the rest of Europe as well as the Mediterranean, including North Africa and the Middle East, a contact that could certainly have influenced the Nordic Bronze Age culture in many ways, including the mythical and legendary lore. Then, some 2,500 years ago, the Iron Age provided some grand changes in culture over time, but probably brought with it a great deal of material and lore from the earlier era. It was also influenced by widespread contact with other parts of the world, such as the Celtic world and later on such as the Roman Empire. It is also during this era that large parts of the Scandinavian populations migrated southwards into the Central European continent, where they became the Germanic tribes, which had extensive contact with the Celtic world and the Slavic world and the Roman Empire. The pagan culture of the Viking Age was a direct continuation of the Iron Age culture, but adding further foreign influence from the Christian and the Muslim worlds until the continuation of the old traditions was completely or nearly, quite broken by the conversion to the Christian religion about 1,000 years ago. But as we have seen, even after that, a lot of the lore of old was remembered and preserved by Christian scribes, in fact. So all was not lost. Now, the ancient lost sources, or we could say ghost sources, these lost sources to more recent preserved sources may derive from a great diversity of traditions. We have ancient legends, even great epics, often based on real historical events and real people, although their stories were probably altered with time. We have pagan, ritual, religious narratives, ritual plays, ritual dialogues, and ritual recitations that may have been remembered and transmitted by initiated priests and priestesses. We also have pagan folklore, fairy tales, narratives and beliefs, songs and ballads. So out of this great prehistoric clouds that we cannot see, that we cannot know for certain, come storytelling traditions that were on one side professional, transmitted by professional initiated priesthoods or Scaldic, and on the other side the sort of lore that was transmitted by lay people, the grandmother's tales and folklore beliefs. So two different sort of versions kept being transmitted over time out of perhaps the same sort of source. Now anyway, whatever remains of all these different lost sources is found in what we refer to today as Norse mythology, as well as in folklore and fairy tales. These ancient lost sources, or ghost sources, may for example have revolved around particular narrative themes, such as the notion of a sleeping beauty, a woman who is spellbound into sleep and who must be woken up, because everybody's suffering when she's asleep. Now this notion keeps appearing in so many different contexts all over Europe and is so prevalent in Norse literature and Edda poetry that it is likely very, very old. It appears in very different contexts, however, as if there were several spin-offs to a very popular tale, and that is probably the case. Over time, spin-offs and their spin-offs may have led to entirely new stories with only the most basic core narratives and themes surviving from the earliest origins. I have earlier written and talked a lot about the maiden with the mead, who must be sought in the underworld, and shown how this repeated narrative in the Edda poems appears to have had a ritual context, an initiation ritual context to be precise. The lore of the hidden maiden in the underworld may have emerged as a ritual narrative, but became such a popular tale that the ritual core narrative seeped into folklore and fairy tales, and from these there were spin-offs, and spin-offs from the spin-offs, until we have numerous different storylines and characters, but all of them following a deeper narrative structure that came with the earliest versions. During the 19th century, fairy tales such as The Sleeping Beauty, Snow White and others seem to represent the folklore narrative traditions that survived in new forms with every new age, all with roots in the earliest ritual context of the quest to wake up the sleeping goddess. Now, whereas we know that core narratives and themes may have had very ancient roots, we know less about the exact age of the Edda poems in the exact form that we know them. When you look up the Edda, you will probably be looking at a translation in which many things may be lost, and even if you find and is able to read the original Old Norse text, even this text represents but a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of an original text that was recorded in the early medieval era and which may or may not have been transmitted orally for countless generations, or just made up just before it was written down the first time. Even if we can deduce that the core themes and the underlying narrative may be thousands of years old, we simply do not know the exact age of the exact poetical composition that we have available today. Unlike Scaldic poetry, which are always attributed to named skalds from the Viking Age era, the Edda poems are notoriously authorless. We simply do not know who first composed them. But they always deal with mythical and legendary material of the supernatural sort. That is, even when a human being feature in these poems, there are always supernatural elements, characters and places involved, and with lots of references to mythological and pagan themes. Many, perhaps most, possibly all Edda poems may have been first composed during the pagan era. Just how early, we do not know. We do know that archaeological finds, rune stones and artworks of the Viking Age often correspond to the themes of Edda poetry, so that the roots to these poems may be found in the Viking Age and even before that. Otherwise, some of these poems may have been composed during the Age of Conversion, when the old and the new religion clashed for the duration of a century or more. Others might even have been composed during the Christian era. It is actually possible to a certain degree for linguists to deduce from the spelling and choice of words about when and where the poem was composed in the form that we know it from the written sources, since language and dialects vary with time and place. However, the poems may have been altered away from the first composition to fit the language of the ones who had it written down, which means that the poem may have existed much earlier too, in a slightly different form. Exactly when each poem was composed first is impossible to know, but what is clear is that they are all closely linked to a very ancient poetic tradition, as well as to age-old mythical pagan concepts, themes and narratives on which these poems are based. The reason why we cannot know exactly where or when each poem began is because they were transmitted orally, that is, people told these stories, sang these songs, recited this poetry based on said stories and songs, or perhaps even poetry made for ritual incantations. Stories will often change a little with each storyteller, change also with culture and with religion and with typical cultural attitudes, so that we never know exactly how the original version was or how old. However, there were ways of ensuring a more literal recording of the original versions, namely through poetry. The poetical form of these narratives and themes, these myths and legends, made the stories more bound, each verse composed in a manner that would be particularly easy to remember due to rhyme and rhythm and poetical metaphors. It is in the poems that we are most likely to find the narrative versions most true to their oldest origins. We still do not know exactly how old the oldest origin of each poem is, but it is easy to find evidence for similar narratives on which the poems may be based, existing way back in the Viking Age and beyond. Some seem to refer to popular legends and even historical events. Others appear to take the form of incantations or ritual dialogue plays that may have been common in connection with pagan rituals. At some point, the old pagan religion to which the Edda poems belonged gave way to the new Christian religion. It took some time, however, and powerful pagan forces were at large, trying hard to preserve their old customs. Even early medieval converts and born Christians seem to have taken an active interest in preserving the older lore, simply for the love of knowledge of history and out of appreciation for the pagan way of making poetry, a tradition that was probably more than 1,000 years old. Sometime during the 11th and the 12th centuries, scribes and scholars connected to the monasteries of the new religion, Christianity, began recording ancient lore. Chronicles and law texts, sagas and poetry were first written down, closely based on the older oral transmissions. This was particularly true for Icelanders, who were also the first to also apply their own language, the Old Norse, rather than the Latin when they began recording the lore of their ancestors, and thus they preserved a lot of the language and a lot of the poetical metaphors that these poems were based on. Most of these earliest recordings are, of course, lost to us. lost to library fires, thieves, the crumbling effects of time, maybe even book-burning events. Yes, I think we should bear in mind the possibility of persecution as a reason why so much of the oldest recordings are lost. The differences between the old and the new religion appear to have been easily confused during and right after the conversion period. The Codex Regius, which contains the most complete collection of Edda poetry that we have, and the only manuscript surviving from this time, was kept hidden away from the public until the 1640s, although it was copied down around 1200. It was as if somebody were safe keeping this last surviving copy of a collection of Edda poetry. The first written works came while paganism was still legal in Iceland, because paganism was not outlawed until about 1100, and still existed in other parts of Scandinavia. We know that paganism was still at large in Sweden perhaps until the 1080s, and in Norway until the 1050s. Well, others came while great-grandparents who were born pagan still lived or were remembered. Old customs and beliefs die hard. It is entirely possible that the earliest written works had way too many pagan perspectives and themes than later scribes could dare to copy down in the face of a medieval church that was becoming increasingly concerned with literally killing whatever they thought of as heresy or paganism, and whoever promoted such things. So there may have been some revisions going on before these older works were somehow lost to us. The Codex Regius and other written sources. The most intense period of recording orally transmitted lore, as well as copying older recordings that are now lost to us, happened during the 1200s and the 1300s. Even here, recordings vanished with time, but this is still the time period from which we have the most written source material that survived into the modern era. This is the time period where we find that famous collection of Edda poetry known as the Codex Regius or the Sämundar Edda, probably recorded during the late 1100s or early 1200s. So this was a collection of Edda poetry copied from older works. This manuscript was copied from an earlier version, now lost, and there were probably several more copies around, but they are all lost too. Perhaps the Codex Regius would have been lost too if somebody had not taken care to hide it away for the duration of 400 years before they gave it back to the authorities. So this manuscript is, therefore, particularly precious to us who study Edda poetry, and it contains most of the Edda poems that are still known to us, although some pages had been torn out. Some of the Edda poems found in the Codex Regius or Sämundar Edda are also found in other written sources, usually in medieval chronicles and saga literature, showing some slight variations between the written sources, which goes to show that not only oral transmissions can mean that changes happen with every storyteller, but also with every scribe, even when copying an older work, and perhaps especially when revising an older work. Now, the Edda poems that are not found in the Codex Regius or the Sämundar Edda are the following: Grógaldr, Fjőlsvinnsmál, Hyndluljóð, Solarljóð, and Hrafnagaldr Odins. Most of these poems are found in far later manuscripts, some dating back even as late as the 1600s, when most traces of pagan beliefs in the north had been eradicated, or at least illegalized, for centuries on end. The lateness of these Edda poems make them somewhat problematic to use as sources to actual pagan beliefs and origins. Maybe they were invented and composed in the form we know them far later than the other Edda poems, which were first written down during the 1st century after the conversion, when pagan beliefs and customs were still remembered. The poems of the Codex Regius are much more likely to have emerged from pagan poets than the later sources. However, the poems found in other, later manuscripts are also copies of older works. They may be copies of copies of copies of copies of much older written originals that may be based on oral transmissions just as old as any of the others. It is very hard to say for sure, but there are many indications we can look for in order to determine whether these poems too, perhaps in earlier forms, existed during the pagan era, or at least were closely based on early Edda poems or other forms of mythical or legendary lore dating back into the pagan era. Christian influences or Christian creations. Well, there has long been a grand tradition of dismissing these poems found only in late sources and focus on the Christian influence they are often perceived to represent, often at the cost of every single pagan element. The desire to see these poems as Christian poems predominantly, Christian poems using the Edda poetical style, has often led to a near complete overlooking of everything that tastes of paganism in these poems. I am going to do the opposite. I am going to emphasize the pagan elements that I believe in fact represent the core themes and concerns of these poems, and I would like to point out that some of the best ancient narratives often have a wonderful knack for surviving the changing times. Several poems for a singular storyline. We are soon going to have a look at the so-called Sveidal, an invented title for an Edda poem that does not actually exist as one Edda poem, but is an umbrella title for 2 different poems, the Grógaldr and the Fjőlsvinnsmál. For some reason or other, Edda poets had made 2 different poems out of the one single narrative. As we shall see, there might even be a 3rd poem, the Hyndluljóð, which should be studied in the same contextual narrative. The use of several different poems to form part of a single greater narrative is actually quite common in Edda poetry. The storyline found in the medieval Völsunga saga, for example, was told over the course of 20 different Edda poems. Each poem may be read on its own, yet each is connected to the others and form part of a larger narrative, all placed in chronological order in the Codex Regius manuscript and later retold as a single story by Snorri Sturluson in his prose Edda, and even later emerging as a whole saga, the Völsunga saga, and as a German medieval epos known as the Nibelungenlied, and many ballads, a living narrative that continued to be told for hundreds of years and even into our own modern time. The events and characters told of in several of these 20 poems that make out a single narrative have historical counterparts, taking us back to the age of the Roman Empire and Attila the Hun. We find early Viking Age art which clearly seem to illustrate events in this narrative. So we know that the storyline is old, reaching back into pagan times, and some of the historical counterparts are so accurate that we cannot but assume that at least parts of this lore already emerged during the 500s. We are, thus, speaking of a whole complex of storytelling, dealing with the same basic narrative, the same themes, and the same legends, with clear roots in the late Iron Age. Real-life events turned into fantastic legends, stories told and retold in many different ways, even until the High Middle Ages, even into our own time, for a span of 1,000 years and more. And this is why I think we should not underestimate the surviving power of a good narrative. Late sources may have very early origins, at least roots. The more variety and evidence of living folklore traditions in many different places, the more likely the story be of ancient origins.